All right, so today we're going deep, really deep into Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
Helmand province, to be exact.
Okay.
I think a lot of people have heard of it. It's been in the news
For
for
sure.
decades. But honestly, what's happening there, well, it's way more complicated than the headlines would lead you to believe. We're going to be talking about this idea of power, survival, and corruption in a place that's seen, well, just an incredible amount of conflict. And for this deep dive, our main source is an article called Afghanistan's Helmand, Unmasking the Harsh Truth Behind Power and Corruption. And it's from Investor. So buckle up because it's going to be, well, it's a wild ride.
Yeah, I mean, what you have here is like this, almost as a perfect example of everything that's been so difficult about Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about like who's in charge. It's really about how those power struggles get all tangled up with just basic survival and then corruption on a level that most people can't even imagine.
Yeah, for sure. So let's rewind a bit. The article starts out by talking about, the US and NATO forces going in with good intentions. It's the early 2000s, get rid of al-Qaeda, bring some stability to the region, but well, as we know now, it created a whole other set of problems.
Exactly, exactly. It's almost like they, I don't know, tried to fix a broken bone, but ended up shattering it even more.
Right.
A huge power vacuum opened up, and well, you had these figures like Isa Khan and Koka stepping right in. The article goes deep into how these guys operated, and it's both fascinating and unsettling.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about Koka first. This is a guy who was working with the Afghan police, but at the same time, there was all this mistrust of foreign forces. I mean, that seems, well, contradictory. It's almost like he was playing both sides.
I think it's even more than just playing both sides. I mean, Koka, he was absolutely essential for any kind of stability, but he was also so deeply embedded in this whole culture of shifting alliances,
Yeah.
knowing who to trust, who to manipulate. I mean, he knew how to play the game to his advantage.
Okay, but wasn't that incredibly dangerous? I mean, what if he picked the wrong side or pushed things too far?
Well, that's the thing about Helmand. There's just no room for error. It's incredibly high stakes, and every single move you make, it could be your last.
Yeah, okay. And then there's Isa Khan. This is the guy who ends up becoming chief of police in Musa Qala after his brother gets injured, but the rumors surrounding him are, well, they're pretty dark. I mean, torture, killings. The article even mentions sexual violence that was witnessed by foreign military personnel. I mean, but he remained in power. How is that even possible?
Well, to understand that, you really have to understand how the game is played in Helmand. I mean, this is a place where power is seized. It's held on to by those who are masters of violence, of tribal allegiances, and just knowing how to manipulate everyone around them. The article describes it as almost like a medieval landscape.
Medieval? What? Okay, that sounds intense. I mean, what does that even mean?
Well, think about it like a world where formal institutions, they either barely exist or they're just so corrupted that they're useless. It's all about who you know, who you can intimidate, and who you can outmaneuver. There's just no room for weakness. The article quotes someone saying, if you meet someone in their 50s who holds a position of power, they've been through unimaginable struggles. And I think that really tells you everything you need to know about how to survive in Helmand.
So in this medieval world, Isa Khan, he rises to the top. But what were his tactics? Was it just, I don't know, brute force? Or was there something more to it?
Well, it seems like he was incredibly skilled at exploiting, local fears.
Yeah.
Influencing those around him. He just understood how power worked in that environment. And sadly, he wasn't the only one using those tactics.
You're talking about the police force. I mean, the article makes it pretty clear that corruption within the police, it was rampant.
Absolutely. The story of Sher Mohammed Akhundzada, this guy, he's a perfect example. Powerful figure. He basically blurred the lines between law enforcement and the drug trade.
Wait a minute, a drug dealer?
Oh, yeah.
And a governor?
Yeah, I know. It's crazy.
I don't know. How does that even work?
Well, that's how things were in Helmand. Power and criminal activity, they went hand in hand. And the police, well, they were right in the middle of it all. I mean, when authorities raided Akhundzada's office, they found 9 tons of opium.
9 tons! That's insane. I mean, this wasn't just like a few bad apples. This sounds like the entire system was rotten.
It was. And this level of corruption, it had a terrible impact on the people there. The article even mentions, police officers demanding children from families for these menial tasks at police posts. And sources reveal that these demands, they were far from innocent. It was a really disturbing abuse of power.
So you have this climate of fear, distrust, where people are constantly worried about the very people who are supposed to be protecting them. I mean, it's It's a breeding ground for exploitation and violence.
Exactly. And that's exactly the kind of environment where someone like Isa Khan could thrive.
Hmm.
He knew how to operate within that system.
Yeah.
How to manipulate people's anxieties and just grab more power for himself.
Chilling. It's a chilling thought. Even journalists who went to Helmand to report on these issues, they found themselves in danger, trying to tell the story, but also worried about their own safety.
Yeah, that was the grim reality of Helmand. When survival is all that matters, well, moral boundaries, they can get pretty blurry.
And then you have the Taliban entering the picture again in August of 2021, and everything changes.
Yeah.
I mean, overnight.
Overnight, the Afghan government collapses and the Taliban sweeps back into power. Now, the article doesn't say exactly what happened to Isa Khan, but the police force, they disappeared from Lusakala. So it's safe to assume there was a massive power shift.
And it just makes you wonder, what was the point of all that intervention? Did it really make things better? Or did it just end up creating a more fractured and corrupt environment?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The article suggests that with the Taliban back, it could be a return to the way things were before 2001, of all the brutality and disregard for human rights that came with it.
Okay, so after all of this, what's next for Helmand? What happens to these people who have already endured so much?
Well, that's what we're going to explore next. We'll dive into the Taliban's ideology, their policies, and just how their return is likely to shape the future of, this already really troubled province.
It's a story that's far from over. And the stakes, well, they couldn't be higher.
So before we went to, I guess, what you call a break, we were talking about the Taliban, their return, and what that might mean for Helmand. And I think to understand that we need to take a closer look at how they actually operate.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to just label them as like, the bad guys or whatever, but I'm guessing it's a lot more complicated than that. What does the article say about their ideology and how that translates into like actual policies on the ground?
Well, their ideology, it's rooted in a very strict interpretation of Islamic law. And they believe in establishing an Islamic emirate. So essentially that means a state that's governed by religious leaders. And this influences everything. From social policies to, economic strategies. It really has huge implications for how they rule.
Okay, so what does that actually look like? How would their version of an Islamic emirate, how would that affect the daily lives of people living in Helmand?
Well, we've already seen some signs, right? Strict dress codes. Particularly for women. Music and entertainment, that's being restricted. And there are even, reports of pretty harsh punishments for anyone who violates their interpretation of Islamic law. It's definitely a big change from the relative freedoms that some people, especially in cities, experienced after the U.S. intervention.
That sounds pretty oppressive. But
Yeah.
what about just the practical stuff, like the economy, security, basic services? How are they handling all that?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. The article suggests that the Taliban are facing some serious challenges. The Afghan economy, it's in ruins after decades of war and sanctions, and the Taliban, well, they just don't have a lot of experience in managing a modern state. And then you have the issue of international recognition and aid, which they desperately need but are struggling to actually get.
So it's not just about imposing their ideology. They also have to, keep the country running. And in a place like Helmand with its history, it's a monumental task.
Exactly. They're trying to assert control, but they're also dealing with the legacy of the previous system, right? All the power structures that were already there before the U.S. even intervened, the tribal allegiances, the patronage networks, that's all still there. And it's deeply intertwined with the drug trade, which, well, it continues to thrive in Helmand.
So you've got this clash, right, between the Taliban's desire for control and the reality on the ground. Helmand has it's got its own rules, its own way of doing things.
Yeah.
And then you throw the drug trade into the mix and it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, for instability, absolutely. The article even it highlights this paradox. The Taliban, in their quest for order, they might actually end up just perpetuating the systems of corruption and exploitation that they claim to oppose.
That's a pretty bleak outlook. Is there any hope for Helmand to break free from this cycle of violence and corruption?
It's really hard to say. The article doesn't really offer any easy answers.
Yeah.
But it definitely makes you think about the long-term consequences of intervention. Do the U.S. and NATO really achieve their objectives? Or did they just end up creating a more volatile environment?
We talked earlier about the power vacuum that was left after the intervention and how figures like Isa Khan and Koka, they kind of stepped in to fill that void. But what about, I don't know, like what about the everyday Afghan people? How has their experience shaped how they view the Taliban's return?
Well, that's a really important question. And the article, it spends some time exploring that. I mean, it emphasizes that the people of Helmand, they've become incredibly resilient. After decades of conflict and hardship, they've learned to adapt. I mean, to survive, to just navigate these constant shifts in power.
So when the Taliban came back, it wasn't necessarily seen as like a complete shock. I mean, they'd already been through so much. It was just another chapter.
Exactly. And that's why the article suggests that those who learn to survive within the previous system with all its corruption and brutality,
Hmm.
they might actually be the ones who thrive under the Taliban.
But doesn't that also mean that this cycle of violence and exploitation, it'll just continue?
It's definitely a possibility. But it's also worth remembering that the Taliban today, I mean, they're not necessarily the same as the Taliban of, the 1990s. They've had time to reflect,
Mhm.
and they're facing, a very different set of
So
challenges.
are you saying there's a chance they might actually govern differently this time around?
It's too early to say for sure.
Mm.
But the article, it does raise the question of whether they might be forced to kind of moderate their stance, to make some compromises,
Yeah.
to govern effectively and to gain that international legitimacy that they need.
That would be a pretty big shift. But what about the people of Helmand? Are they just, I don't know, are they just passive observers in all of this?
The article really emphasizes the agency of the Afghan people. I mean, they've always played a role in shaping their own destiny, even when facing, incredible odds. They've resisted oppression. They've negotiated with power brokers. They've found ways to carve out a life for themselves.
So even under Taliban rule, they'll find ways to adapt, to resist. They'll
Yeah.
keep fighting for their survival and for a better future.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to not fall into these simple narratives that paint the Afghan people as either, helpless victims or unwavering Taliban supporters.
Right. They're complex. They have their own experiences, their own hopes and dreams, and those voices, they deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. And that's where journalism, that's where it becomes so crucial. It's about telling those stories,
Right.
highlighting the nuances, challenging those attempts to oversimplify.
And the article does a good job of emphasizing that, right? It's not just about reporting the facts, but understanding, the context, the
Yeah.
motivations, the human stories behind those facts.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive, so valuable. It's not about easy answers or passing judgment. It's about wrestling with these uncomfortable truths,
Mm.
acknowledging the failures,
Mm.
and trying to make sense of something that's really hard to explain.
Helmand is incredibly complex, and it's easy to get lost in the details. But if there's one thing that really sticks out to me, it's the resilience of the people.
I agree. I mean, they've endured so much, but they still find ways to survive, even to thrive. I think their stories, it's a real testament to the human spirit, that ability to adapt and to persevere, even when things are really, really tough.
But resilience alone, it's not enough, is it? They need peace. They
Yeah.
need stability. They need opportunity. They need a chance to rebuild their lives and to create a better future.
And that brings us right back to that question that the Investor article asked. Will those who learn to survive in the old system, will they just adapt and thrive under the Taliban? Will this just be more of the same, or will it be a turning point?
Yeah, it's almost like this paradox, right? This incredible resilience, but at the same time, this deep, deep corruption.
I know. It's one of the things that struck me most about Helm. I mean, you see these people who've been through so much, but they still have this hope, this ability to find a way to make things work, even when the system's totally rigged against them.
Yeah, yeah. That makes me think about what the article said about the Taliban coming back. Is it even possible that this time things could actually be different? Could they actually govern in a way that helps people?
It's a tough question. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no easy answer. The Taliban, they have this history, right? And their ideology, it doesn't really line up with a lot of the values that we hold. But they're also dealing with a very different reality now than they were back in the 90s.
So how is it different besides the obvious stuff? The world's different, technology's changed. What are they facing now that they didn't have to deal with before?
Well, for one, they were in charge of running a whole country. Back then, it was mostly about controlling territory and enforcing, their version of Islamic law. But now they have to deal with all this other stuff. Basic services, erect economy, diplomacy. It's a lot.
It's a huge shift, and the Afghan economy, I mean, it's a mess. After years of war, sanctions, it's really fragile.
Exactly. And that's where international aid becomes so important. They need it desperately
Yeah.
to rebuild. But they're having a hard time getting it because of, their human rights record, their unwillingness to compromise on certain things.
So they're stuck. They need to change to get the aid they need. But if they change too much, they risk losing support, losing their authority.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. And who knows if they can, pull it off. But some people believe that they might actually be a little more pragmatic this time around. Maybe they've learned from the past. Maybe they understand that they need to be seen as legitimate on the world stage.
Hmm?
And they've got a much bigger job ahead of them than they did before.
It's like I don't know, they've had to grow up or something.
Yeah, you could say that. And maybe that means they'll be willing to make some changes that wouldn't have even been considered before.
Okay, but I mean, even if they do change, even if they do moderate their stance, there's still so much to deal with. The corruption, the power of the drug lords, all the tribal rivalries. It's hard to imagine how they're going to overcome all that.
Yeah, it's a long road ahead. But I think it's important to remember that change is always possible, even in the most difficult situations. And the Afghan people, I mean, they've shown us over and over again that they're resilient, that they can adapt.
So we come back to that question, right, from the article. Will the people who survived the old system, will they just figure out how to thrive under the Taliban?
Yeah. And I think it's a question that really makes us think about the situation in a more nuanced way.
We saw how people like Isa Khan and Koka, how they managed to survive in this world of power and corruption, the choices they made. Sometimes they were morally questionable, but they were trying to survive.
And I think their stories show that even in a system that's so messed up, so broken, there are shades of gray. People are both victims and perpetrators. They're complicit and they're resistant. It's complicated.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Helmand, I think we're left with a lot of uncertainty, but also maybe a little bit of hope. The future is, well, it's unknown. But one thing's for sure, the people there, they'll keep finding a way. They'll keep adapting. They'll keep resisting. And they'll keep hoping for a better future.
Yeah. And their stories, their struggles, their triumphs, I mean, they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be understood.
This has been an incredible journey. I mean, I've learned so much more than I ever could have just from reading the headlines. It really makes you realize how important it is to, to dig deeper, to question what you think you know, and to really listen to the people who are living through all of this.
And hopefully it's giving you, the listener, a better understanding of the human cost of conflict, the power of the human spirit, and the importance of really engaging with the world, even when it's really messy and complicated.